and to talk within that ambition about mental health. We have a very strong culture at HSBC. It's a very hierarchical organization. And I quickly figured out that if I started to talk about this subject, that would give permission to others to talk about. And once you start a conversation like this, you have to learn very quickly, because you lead with something based on research and information and your own preparation, and you quickly get some feedback. So where are we? Well, I think we're in a place now where we can comfortably say within HSBC that everybody has mental health. The first time I spoke about it, I didn't speak in those terms. We're all comfortable that we have physical health. Well, we all have mental health. Those of you who think you enjoy good mental health, well, that's great. But we all have mental health. And therefore, we all sit on this spectrum, a spectrum that at the tough end involves illness, where professional help and care and treatment is required, down to the wellness and well-being end, which is where most of, I guess, the people that I lead would sit. And when I started this conversation, I was really focused on the well-being and wellness end and creating an environment where people can show up and be their best. And what I wanted to do as a leader was just lean on the neuroscience and the psychology that's been done, that we don't have to relearn, to create an environment. Because I know, personally, the profound difference between being at my best and not being at my best, and the way that that transmits. At the wellness end, making sure that people are able to speak up. We know that fear is terribly corrosive when it comes to effective decision-making. Making sure that people are well and rested, and that they're not cognitively impaired because they're too tired or exhausted, etc. So we spent a lot of time in that and developing that conversation, which has been great fun. But I've also had some really great insights into the tough end of the spectrum, the illness end. And what I would share I've learned is this. Within our system of 238,000 people, we do have a lot of people who have survived mental illness and who have come out the other side. And we've learned that, just as with physical illness, you can recover. But I've also learned that those who have recovered often possess a resilience and a resourcefulness and an interest in human nature and an empathy and an EQ that often the rest of us don't possess. So I now absolutely regard the survivors who've come through this as an absolute asset to HSBC and a community that we should celebrate. This journey towards the healthiest human system is the most inspiring thing I get to do in my job. How will I know when we've got there? I think we'll have got there when everybody at HSBC feels safe and secure in the workplace. They can turn up and be themselves, and they know that they're in a place where they're safe and secure, and where they can be confident that wherever they are on that spectrum, that tomorrow can be a little bit better than today. And if we get to that point, we'll be in a good place.
Mr. Tyson, how big of a problem is mental health, the issues that go along with that? What's Kaiser Permanente doing to tackle that?
It's a quiet epidemic because we don't talk about it openly. It is, when you really look at the evolution of the healthcare system, at least in the United States, it is still predominantly a fix-me system. It is available after something happens when you get sick. Then on top of that, we decided to separate the head from the body. And so we work on the body, but when something is going on in the head, we send you to another room. We create another record. And then we put a negative stigma around it where you can't talk about it. So every organ in the body is covered. The heart, the lungs, kidneys. We talk about it freely. I have diabetes. I have cancer. I have heart disease. I have a mental problem. It's one of those, I don't think I can talk about that. Secondly, we design a health system, and this is what I bring here to the World Economic Forum, that in the World Economic Forum narrative, in which at least the first and the second industrial revolution was really about you created something through the physical body. So you had a health system that helped people to return back to health from a physical standpoint. In the third revolution, and for sure what we're talking about now, is about the mind, the cognitive. You put that against a backdrop of where we are today, and you look at the statistics that we're talking about. Young girls between the ages of 15 and 19, the #1 killer, suicide. Someone with severe depression and mental illnesses has a life expectancy that's up to 20 to 25 years shorter than the normal lifespan. You look at where they end up at in the severe end of homelessness and all the other things. And I would offer to you, we have to transform and reconstruct the system that now is engineered to take care of the real world problems of the 21st century, which is mental wellness and well-being. So inside of Kaiser Permanente, we have framed 3 building blocks of the future health system. Medical excellence, mental health and wellness, and social care. And that you cannot look at these in a vacuum, you have to look at it holistically. Because the centerpiece is how to help a person live as productive and as healthy of a life as possible. And the piecemeal approach is no longer, I think, the right way to address mental health and wellness to help individuals. So we have resourced a lot on asking people to speak up and speak out, which we call Find Your Words. And we are redesigning a delivery system. So for example, we have mental health specialists in our primary care units. We have new technology where you can reach us offline. Designing new systems to meet people where they are and to figure out how we bring these together. You know, the final thing I would say is that we are also focused now on social care that we're putting directly in the lane of health and wellness. Last year, I announced a $200 million commitment that our organization is making to homelessness and affordability of housing. Last week, we announced that we bought with someone else a building in Oakland, California to protect affordable housing. We adopted 500 homeless individuals who are living on the streets, age 50 and above, with at least one chronic disease. And we're going to see this from the end to the end in terms of that they are permanently housed in the right place. Mm-hmm. Some are dealing with mental illnesses, so we have to figure that out. Some has to work through housing. And we hope to design an ecosystem around that where we can replicate in other markets around the United States in which Kaiser Permanente exists.
Your Royal Highness, I think everyone's touched on this issue of stigma and how that has to be knocked down first before you can make any progress in these areas. By you addressing this, but not only addressing it, also admitting that you've grappled with it yourself, I can only imagine that that made a lot of people feel more willing to come forward and talk about their own issues. Do you hear this from people? Have you been approached by a lot of people?
I think predominantly the Heads Together campaign and how sort of out there we were with mental health. I've had a lot of people, the most random moments in my life, all around the world, they come up and tap me on the shoulder and say thank you. And you don't need to actually have any more conversation than that. You just know that that person has either had relatives, friends, or themselves, they've been through it, and they just know that they're grateful that somebody is saying that it's okay to talk about this. And I think what I've learned is that, 10 years ago, I didn't know anything about mental health. I really didn't. And I immersed myself in this topic because we realized and identified that this was a key social problem. Not just for the UK, this was global. But somebody somewhere had to burst the bubble, it had to come out. And it's been a real journey for me, and I've learned so much from it. And as all the other distinguished panelists have said, the scale, the spectrum is enormous. And really, we've got to start tackling it now because there are still so many people who are suffering in silence. And there's this stigma attached to mental health, which we've got to completely obliterate before we can progress to the next stage. And when I started feeling issues myself, it was from my air ambulance work. Mm-hmm. I was dealing with a lot of trauma on a day in, day out basis. And stuff that your body is not programmed to deal with, there's just no way it is. And that's why I feel such empathy and solidarity with the medical community. You know, yes, it's a job, and they go on about how it's a job, but my goodness, they do a very, very hard job every single day. And someone described to me who is suffering themselves in the medical community that, you know, you have a suit of armor on. You know, you deal with the job every day. You deal with children being very sick. You deal with elderly people, whatever it might be. But something in the day comes along that is closely related to your own personal life, and that really takes you over a line. It's only natural. You're human. You know, if you don't feel anything, then I'd say you need to go and get checked out for that. So it's kind of totally normal that we feel this way. But for some reason, we're all embarrassed by emotions. British people particularly, we're very embarrassed about revealing our emotions. And I take it back as far as the war. And I think, you know, the wartime was very, very difficult for everybody. And people dealing with their own ways, losing so many loved ones and dealing with such horrendous circumstances that no matter how much you could talk, you were never going to fix the issue. It was so destructive and, you know, devastating that I think a whole generation just decided that this was the best way of dealing with it. They then completely by accident passed that on to the next generation. You know, we all learn from our parents. We all learn from how they deal with things. So a whole generation then inherited that this was the way you deal with problems. You don't talk about them. And I think now there's a generation here that are finally realizing that this is not normal, we should talk about it and we should get over it. And that's why it's fantastic that, you know, people like the Prime Minister of New Zealand, you know, she understands and she gets this, that this is a generational issue and that we've got to start tackling it now so that our children and our grandchildren don't have to go through this sort of process and they can be a lot more open about it.
Was there a particular incident at work that really made you think this hit home in such a hard way?
Yeah, and I still find it very difficult to talk about it. I get very emotional about it because it relates very closely to my children. And so it is very, very hard to talk about it. And lots of people in the medical community have these particular cases where I don't think you ever get over it because you go through someone else's pain and you live with it. And I just felt that the most important was understanding and realizing that it was there. And I think if I hadn't been doing what I was doing, I might have gone into my shell a bit and gone, I can deal with this myself. And then potentially down the line, it manifests itself in a much worse situation. So I very much felt that this was an important thing. And we talk about it with my colleagues and other guys and girls there. And as a team, you draw it out and you debrief about it. And the whole team was very affected by this one particular job. And you manage it that way. And I know that if I hadn't taken the action that I did then, I would have definitely gone down a slippery slope and I would have been dealing with mental illness on a different level.
Prime Minister Ardern, I was surprised to hear when we were talking before that New Zealand looks at this a little differently. It's not an issue that's kind of tamped down as much. It's very much talked about and has been for a long time.
We absolutely have the conversation, absolutely. And unfortunately, that's a consequence of those staggering statistics. You know, probably when people think of New Zealand, they don't think that we would have one of the highest rates of youth suicide in the OECD. It's not a natural connection that you would make. But the fact that we talk about it doesn't mean the stigma is gone.
Yeah. Doesn't
mean that we have that conversation at a national level. It still doesn't carry stigma at an individual level. One of the things that I think, you know, at least have made the observation that has over time been really powerful, everyone will know New Zealanders are quiet fans of rugby. We keep our sporting obsession quite low-key. But of course, there's attached to rugby a particular culture. One of our very famous rugby players in New Zealand became part of a campaign talking openly about mental health issues. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, in some ways has been, was, I think, quite groundbreaking. It was the start of some of those conversations, but not just at a national level, but personalising it. And just because I have the opportunity to do so, I do want to pay tribute to His Royal Highness. I just don't think you can underestimate the power at an international level of you having spoken so openly. It's had the effect on the global stage of a rugby player on a domestic stage has had, and I think policies matter, programs matter, but actually conversations matter enormously. And when you have someone of such standing, having that conversation personally, you know, what does it say to that young person in the United States or that young person in Zimbabwe or New Zealand? I think it's incredibly important. Then the rest comes to us to then make it easy for those individuals who need help to be able to access help, to access that support, to make it easier. And that's where we start getting into something more than the conversation and into the policy, into the political.
Yeah, and let me open it up a little bit there. Whoever wants to jump in on this. Once you acknowledge there's a problem, once you have people maybe talking about it a little more openly, what happens next? What is the next step? Dr. Chibanda, Mr. Tyson, maybe one of you has an opinion on that. What do you do at that point?
Well, it's a combination, I think, of how do you then have a safety net to reach the person. In our Find Your Words campaign, we openly give both an address that they can reach us through technology, a phone number to reach out to, so we could begin that process. Just to give you an example, last year in Kaiser Permanente, for all of our mental-related visits and health care, that was over 4 million visits last year. So just to give you a sense of the mass production on the supply side, and we're hiring resources and retraining and doing other things. But it is absolutely the right headache to have, where you have people speaking up and speaking out. But then how do you build a new infrastructure to lend support and to help someone through it? I had one of my executives who speaks very openly about what he's dealt with, and he described to our leadership team one day, it's like wearing a helmet that you can't take off. And it gives such a visual image of what it must be like for those of us who may think we don't have it, but whatever it is. And one of the things I do around the country, and I'll do it now a little bit, audience participation, I always ask the audience, and I'm asking you now, how many in this audience know of someone, family, friend, neighbor, loved one, possibly yourself, who is suffering from, or you believe is suffering from, some form of mental illness?
Yeah.
I think
that tells it all.
Yeah, pretty much everyone.
And just multiply that around the world. Yeah. And I do this when I speak, and it reminds me of the road that we all have to travel and the recreation now of an ecosystem that deals with the reality of what is life in the 21st century. And I think that's the journey that we're on.
Dr. Chibanda, we pointed out at the top that that there's not enough money that's being spent on this by governments, by other organizations around the world. On average, governments spending less than 1%, not of their budget, but of their health budget on this issue. What do you do with the shortage of resources? What resources would it take to really get your arms around this?
So I think there are a lot of positives, you know. So firstly, if we look at the last 15 years, there's really been an exponential growth of evidence-based programs, you know, that tick the box in terms of, you know, the evidence, the cost-effectiveness, scalability, you know, simple, cheap, it can be replicated. The key question really is we've gained traction, you know, in terms of producing the evidence. We really now need to be scaling up the programs that are simple. We know that there's quite a number of programs out there. We know enough to be scaling up. And I guess this is why this year in Davos, we're really saying it's time to act. You know, as you just illustrated, you know, everyone everywhere should have someone to turn to for their mental health needs. It's not always about resources. I think often it's about getting the right mix and making sure that we're getting the appropriate returns for our investment in a program, you know. And so I think for instance, if you look at low and middle income countries, most countries invest in psychiatric institutions, which is an outdated concept. If the few resources that are in low and middle income countries could be focused in the community, it would make a huge difference. You know, we need to take mental health to the community. And I think this is one of the reasons why the Friendship Bench is successful. It's a program which is embedded in the community and it's run by community members. We need more of those kind of programs. With the little resources that we have, we can make a huge difference if we allocate those resources in the right places.
Prime Minister?
I would absolutely agree with that, but if I were to make another plea as well, and perhaps this is just what I know at least we're finding is that focus on early intervention, also meaning early literally in terms of our life course. You know, at least at home we know that 3 out of 4 of people who will experience mental health issues will first experience them when they're under the age of 25.
Oh yeah, that's true.
So we know if we want to get in early, making sure those services are available for our young people. One thing that we've looked at some of the evidence base around has told us that when you provide service within schools, that is incredibly beneficial. So we made a decision, therefore, that we would roll out through every secondary school in New Zealand, state's secondary school, nurses in our schools that work within health teams, knowing that a young person might not always go to their counsellor, but they will often perhaps seek support around sexual health or drug and alcohol issues or just everyday medical issues. And having those nurses available has proven through evidence to be a really successful way of also dealing with youth mental health issues. And we've particularly focused even on primary school age children in areas where we unfortunately have had the occurrence of severe earthquakes, because we know that's affected our children and young people's resilience.
Yeah.
But what I didn't anticipate was the connection with addiction. That was something I've learned since being in this job, that those who are showing up at our addiction services, 70% of them had a coexisting mental health issue as well. And so that's something we're now really having to try and deal with our addiction, our drug and alcohol issues as health issues rather than justice issues, to make sure that we're dealing with the mental health element of those things too. So those are at least just our learnings anyway.
No, I think those are pretty much what the rest of the world is also thinking about. If you reflect on the Wellcome Trust today, you know, launching the 200 million fund, one of the focuses is young people, because most mental health issues start during early adolescence, and so there are programs out there which are simple, which can be introduced. But another thing that's important is also prevention, something that we don't talk about much, you know, resilience. What do we need to do to enhance resilience in our communities? You know, what are the factors that determine resilience? Again, it's another area of work where we need to really be looking into and promoting resilience, you know, instead of just focusing on the treatments.
Sure. Yeah. Folks, I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience as well. If you don't mind, if you have a question, raise your hand. We'll get a microphone to you. If you could introduce yourself, tell us who you are, go ahead and give your question, and then we'll kind of direct it around the panel. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much. I'm Ed Whiting from the Wellcome Trust, so thank you very much, Dixon, for pre-announcing our mental health initiative. $260 million to radically reform mental health science, looking at early intervention for anxiety and depression in young people particularly. Thank you to the panel for your continued and new commitment. We've got to get our act together, and it's amazing to have this platform here. In Wellcome, we're also an employer of 700 people. We support 14,000 researchers. We care about their well-being. We're looking at mental health first aid. We're looking at well-being. We're looking at whether a 4-day week is right for us as an organisation. My question for the panel is, you know, what can we do together to ensure that the action we take together on mental health is underpinned by the best scientific knowledge and insight available?
Mr. Flint, maybe you could start with that, since you're focusing on 265,000 people in your workplace, too.
Yeah, indeed. So big population across 66 countries. I think the first reflection is when we started this conversation, you get an echo back from the organisation, and it's been really fascinating to see where we've received an echo and where we haven't. So this conversation is developing really nicely in the UK, but in many parts of the world that we serve, we're getting silence. So we have big populations in parts of Asia, and when the sense to date is that they're not really yet ready for that conversation. But the neuroscience and psychology of human beings is pretty consistent, irrespective of where in the world we live. So I think we must rely on that. We need to develop a better understanding of the cultural differences that either allow this conversation to flourish or prevent the conversation from taking root. As I've begun to learn about this, it's been really reassuring actually to find that there are well-established disciplines and sciences that tell us more than enough at this stage. We don't need to, the body of research in this, I think, gives us more than enough of a foundation. So every reason for optimism, but the conversation is not a uniform conversation across the world.
Other questions from the audience?
Hi.
Oh, sorry, where are we?
I have a mic.
Okay, here and then back here.
Hi, I'm Julia Luscombe. I'm a global shaper from Chicago. A majority of individuals in the prison system have mental health issues. So could any of you speak to actions you're taking or innovative approaches you've seen to address mental health in the prison system?
You know, I'm really glad you raised that particular question. It's a high interest area for me and for Kaiser Permanente. And part of it is starting to engage in those conversations. I talk a lot about, for example, that the reality is that the jail system has served as the default mental health hospitals for many of our states in the United States. And the prison system is ill-informed and ill-equipped to handle those situations. The other thing that we are starting to spend more time is how do you deal with the intervention of how to address and deal with someone who is in front of you clearly suffering from a mental health process. Many in the police force have been taught certain ways, obviously, to get control of the situation that leads to injuries and deaths and other situations. And so there's an educational aspect that we still need to work on together about what's the new technique and the training to diffuse issues to begin to address it. And I think that the third issue is around the lack of the infrastructure in our country and the totality of it. And so there are a lot of hospital beds being used as a mental hospital setting. And most of the laws that are written to hold someone against their will, but for their safety, is very limited in scope. So we have to address all of that in a very holistic way as we look at the challenges of the mental health population. And by the way, in our work that we're doing around the homeless situation, same issue that in a lot of situations you will find a large percentage of those who are homeless is, in fact, dealing with some severe mental challenges.
Another question over here? Sure.
Hi, my name's Alicia London.
I think we have a microphone right here for you. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Alicia London. I am the CEO of United for Global Mental Health. Firstly, I just wanted to thank all of you for your incredible leadership. This is so needed on this issue globally, as we've heard today. I wanted to go back to your question a little earlier, Becky, on financing. Mm-hmm. I think it's such a strong indication of that kind of leadership not being there around the world when, on average, 1% of health budgets are spent on this issue. The Lancet Commission on Global Health and Sustainable Development has said that needs to be at least 5% in low-income countries and 10% in high-income countries, and there's such a long way to go. On foreign aid as well, it's minuscule alongside other physical health issues as we've focused on in the past, as Bernard has explained. At United for Global Mental Health, we were founded to help elevate the citizen voice. There is a campaign coming. We're meeting in South Africa next week with campaigners from all around the world to make these voices heard to their leaders, to try and get more of that action. But my question to you is, what do you think is needed at that leadership level this year, coming out of Davos, so that maybe next year at Davos, we'll have even more leaders with those tangible commitments coming through?
Prime Minister, you want to tackle that one?
Well, I mean, spending is one indicator. I think in New Zealand, I think we're spending roughly 9% on mental health services. But actually,
9% of the health budget?
Yes.
Wow.
But I'm not entirely convinced that's necessarily the best indicator of quality for us, for those who are trying to access mental health services. Because so many are trying to access those services, and B, what are we doing to make sure that we're doing that preventative work and really supporting that general well-being of our population. And so, as was said in the introductions, in our first 100 days, we went out and we undertook this piece of work around mental health and addiction, which is reported back to us recently. And essentially what we decided was that we want to prioritise mental health in our budget this year, and it is one of 5 priority areas for us. But more than that, we need to, on an ongoing basis, measure our success, and I've talked quite a bit about this here at Davos, measure our success as a nation beyond just economic measures to measures of well-being, because when you look at the connection between mental health and so many other issues, addiction, our criminal justice system, and I've visited a lot of prisons in New Zealand, and I've seen a lot of people who have mental health issues, and you cannot determine the chicken and egg between addiction and mental health and criminality in some cases. And so the linkage between all of these issues, I think, speaks to the fact that we have to take a general wellbeing approach. I'll give you one final little example, if you'll indulge me.
Sure.
When I first came into politics, I've always had a passion for children, and one of my areas has been child protection. And I remember sitting down one day to look through all of the coroner's reports around children who had lost their lives while they were in the care of the state. And I was expecting to see horrific stories of abuse, domestic violence. And yes, I saw that. What I did not expect was the number of young people who took their own lives, and subsequently learn about the connection between domestic violence or even witnessing domestic violence and mental health issues. All of the issues around well-being are so deeply connected. We can call them, as our Children's Commissioner has, wicked problems. And so, yes, mental health must be a focus for us, as general health and well-being should be. But actually, if we start taking a well-being approach, then we start dealing with the difficult connection between all of these issues, be it addiction, be it our criminal justice system, be it violence. And that's where we're going as a country, trying to address these intergenerational issues and hopefully just create an environment as a country where people's well-being thrives.
Your Royal Highness, is that what you saw also?
Yeah, I mean, I echo what the Prime Minister's saying there. It's very, very important, and it's so interwoven that actually mental health itself, it's not really kind of like you put your hand on it and that's mental health. It's so fluid, it's sort of random. The Prime Minister's right, and the panel all by saying, it starts younger people. The early intervention is so important. That is crucial to get in there nice and early and prevent it from getting the problem is really what it's all about. But in answer, and Alicia, I must say hello to you because Alicia helped run our mental health campaign together, so it's good to see Alicia here. On your sort of question, I think more leaders need to talk about it. I think big CEOs coming out and talking about what they're doing, prioritising mental health within the workplace. From our Heads Together research that we did, only 2% of people felt confident to talk to their HR department. And that's a staggering number if you think about it, because, there's a lot of HR people in here, I'm sure, so I better be careful what I say. But it should be a lot easier to go to your HR department and speak about issues at work. Bear in mind, we spend so much of our lives at work. It would seem sensible that would be a good place to start. But again, the culture within the business, within the company, whatever it might be, has to come from the top. There has to be a feeling that it's okay to talk about it. It's okay to be mentally ill and have that support around the business. So I think I'd love to see more CEOs and those of people in positions of leadership come out and talk about their own mental health, or the fact that they prioritise mental health within the workplace. And I think I've met a number of CEOs who have been through a mental health battle, have had very severe mental health issues, yet they're still CEO of a major company. That should be the positive story that comes out of it, is that despite your mental health, look what you can achieve. And that's the normalising of mental health that needs to take place. And also on that, sorry to go on, but I think having a conversation with somebody you've never had a conversation with before at work, ask them a question you might not have asked them before, and you'll be surprised by the answer you get. That one conversation, that one small intervention, that one bit of time you take out that you might not have thought about before could open up a whole new world for that person you've spoken to. and it's okay to do that. And I think those are the sorts of actions we need to see coming out of this year.
I think you should start your own personal friendship bench.
Yeah, sure.
It'll be very popular.
John, you want to follow up on that?
Actually, and just picking up from the point that His Royal Highness just made, we shouldn't be afraid that this is going to require, certainly in the private sector, this is going to require massive amounts of budgets that we can't afford. If you look at the costs that are attributed to mental ill health, and then you extrapolate that through to the full spectrum and begin to imagine what the productivity benefits are of improving well-being, intuitively the business case is completely compelling. Now, my finance director would be shaking in his boots at this point, but it should be very compelling. Frankly, our industry has nowhere to hide on this. We have no excuses. My organization, it costs $34 billion a year to run, and more than half of that money is spent on our people. So budgets are not an issue. Prioritization is an issue, but I think we can take comfort from the fact that some of these simple interventions, the conversation with someone that might be looking a bit down, the friendship bench that Dr. Chimamanda has developed, they're fantastic. They don't cost the world, and they make an enormous difference. So I would like to see in my industry us compete with each other on this basis. It's the best front on which to compete.
Dr. Chimamanda, in terms of your industry, we talked a little bit about this before we came out here. You've had to take all the medical terminology and skills and everything that you've learned and try and find a way to kind of translate that into English when you're trying to use this and help other people learn the same techniques.
Yeah, I think language is very important in mental health, and not only in Africa. We found this out in New York City as well. The words that you use to describe the symptoms, the lived experiences, makes such a huge difference on how you connect with a person who's sitting on the bench. How you manage to convey empathy. It's all in the language, the body language, the non-verbal communication, all those little things that we often don't take seriously. I know the friendship bench is very much rooted in science, but there's that very important component, which is the human contact, which makes it successful, as I said earlier on. And so using these indigenous concepts of distress is very important. For instance, on the friendship bench, we don't normally use terms like schizophrenia, bipolar, affective disorder. We don't use those terms. We focus on the quality of life of the person that comes to the bench. What do we need to do to actually improve the quality of your life? Those kind of things, they make a huge difference.
Bernard?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is just critically important. When I talk to my colleagues, I often frame it as we're already spending the money. Mm-hmm. So the question is, how do we want to use our brain power in the redistribution? So you take, for example, the #1 disability is associated with depression. And think about how much money we spend in our companies dealing with disability payments. Well, how do we start to go upstream when we are working those kind of issues? We bring forward the research. I'm very happy that we're talking about the childhood situation. We actually did a study with the government, and we went back and looked at about 17,000 families, individuals, and was able to trace it back to the childhood. And we now have data on what we call an adverse childhood experience. And we can show you the correlation of those experiences to health and mental issues as they went into adulthood. And 3 or 4 of those adverse incidences when you're a child, like a divorce, like physical, mental abuse, like being surrounded by drug addiction, those kinds of things that creates a traumatic experience for you, carries out throughout your life. Mm-hmm. And then finally, all of us should be looking at what happens in a day of a life at work, because it's so different now. We all can experience this theme when we were starting to grow in our companies, in which we were taught to believe that you can leave your problems at home and come and focus on the work. Well, now your problems walk with you every day, every minute, every hour, and it's because of, in large part, the technology and the connections. So how do we rethink people policies in our companies that allows individuals to really breathe and have a sense of wholeness and being in charge of their lives? And right now, there are a lot of people, as I said this morning, you know, at the Fourth Industrial Revolution, we feel great because we feel empowered that we're changing the world. But a lot of people are hearing something very different about the interpretation of what that really means. And so we got to find the right balance.
I will say I've heard us break down some pretty important ideas that have withstood decades and decades. Everything from you leave your problems at home when you're at work and don't focus on it to keep calm and carry on. All of that kind of getting knocked down. Here's a couple key takeaways that I think we're just hitting the end of the session here. But my key takeaways that I've heard from this is that it's not one problem, it's interwoven. You have everything from homelessness to addiction to criminality that's all wrapped up in this. So you can't put your finger on one issue. Stigma is a huge issue still, and finding leaders who can kind of speak out on this is the first step in trying to get more openness on this. Resources is a big issue, not just about more, but also about using them more wisely, and prioritization is a key. Workplaces can and should be leading the way, but of course early intervention is key too. If I can just go down the line, I'd like to ask each of you just a final question on this. WEF really wants to put a focus on this and make sure that we are looking for solutions. The question I'll ask is, what commitment can you make, either as an individual or on behalf of your organization, to promote mental health in 2019? If we came back here a year from now, here's what you said you could do. Bernard, I'll start with you.
I'll keep on speaking up and speaking out and putting my money where my mouth is.
John?
Yeah, so we're going to keep the conversation alive as well, certainly at my level, but we're also going to be equipping our managers with mental health first aid skills so that they can spot the warning signs and direct people to the resources and the care that's needed, if it's needed.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Chabanda?
We'll continue to scale up the friendship bench because it's evidence-based until really it becomes a low-hanging fruit in the community.
Mm-hmm. Prime Minister Ardern?
I've probably already spoken a little bit about it, but do you know, I think there's probably something about in politics trying to model the kind of behaviour that we want to see in the rest of civil society. So I'm going to keep trying to model kindness.
Mm-hmm. That's a lesson we can all take home with us. Your Royal Highness?
I think I'm definitely going to have that conversation with somebody that needs to happen, as in, you know, looking for those moments when somebody is maybe reaching out. I think also I'm going to work with a lot with sport. I'm going to try and use sport as a vehicle to smash more stigma around mental health. I think there's a lot of ingrained issues there that can come out. I also think that I'm going to work with suicide quite a bit this year as well, particularly with male suicide, because I think that's one of the biggest killers in the UK of young men. Mm-hmm. And I think just keep momentum going. I think it's really important. We've reached the point now where we're having a panel at Davos with all of you here on mental health, which maybe 10 years ago this wasn't even feasible. So I think real progress is being made, and I just think we all need to keep the momentum going.
One final note that I will again emphasize to everyone is the friendship bench is here. It's downstairs in the main corridor. Bernard said that he sat on it today and felt like he opened up and had his own session on it. So stop by, check it out. I would like to again thank all of our distinguished panelists here today, and thank you all for being here today.